Are we good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for coming to this panel. I'm really excited to introduce the very talented women that I have on stage with me. My name is Krystina Rubino. I'm the general manager of the offline marketing practice at Right Side Up. I will be your moderator for this panel, and I can't wait to dig into all of the insights from these wonderful humans. Fatima, do you want to give an intro and then we'll go down the row?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Fatima Zaidi. I'm the founder and CEO of Quill and co-host. Quill is a full-service production agency. We work with Fortune 500 brands to create their podcasts. And we, a few years ago, also launched a SaaS product to support brands with the analytics that they require to grow their shows. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's our first time sponsoring a podcasting track at South by Southwest. We're really excited that they're opening the world to our industry, and we've curated this wonderful group of ladies to help share insights today. So with that, I'll pass it over to Margaux.
Hi everyone, I'm Margaux Natiello. I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager at AG1, a company known for pioneering the foundational nutrition movement through our daily health drink, AG1, where we empower people on their journey to health ownership. It is such a treat to be here in sunny Austin, coming from New York. I'm so looking forward to meeting you all. Our esteemed moderator, Krystina, is a treasured friend and mentor to me, so it is such an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hello, I'm Robin Bennefield, and I'm a brand storyteller and editorial content strategist, formerly with Marriott International. And I produced a podcast called About the Journey. And so I'm here to speak a bit about the process of creating a podcast with a brand. And it is an absolute pleasure to be here. I met Fatima at Podcast Movement. And I've been really impressed with the work that Quill and co-host have been doing, and I'm really happy to be here to join you all today. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I come at things from the advertising side of the podcast industry, and yet also I actually host a show. So I like to think that I kind of bridge both sides of the industry a little bit. I'll start this and maybe again kind of go down the line a little bit here, but what's the most underrated or even unexpected benefit of investing in podcasts as a brand?
Maybe I'll start and we can, perfect. So I think one stat that I always like to share is that 93% of people who start a podcast episode end up listening to the entire episode. Whereas if you look at comparable forms of media, typically a 30-minute video only has a 12% completion rate. And so our clients have found that, surprisingly, when they're trying to reach their audiences through podcasting, they can do it at a time where they're not competing with other marketing priorities. You can be driving to work and listening to a podcast, but you can't be watching a video. You can be walking your dog and listening to a podcast, but you can't be reading an article. So every time I think about watching a Netflix show, the competition is Crave, Amazon Prime, HBO, Peacock, and podcasting is no different. And so surprisingly in this industry, our clients have found that not only is there very limited competition, being actively engaged in another activity seems to increase engagement rather than hurt engagement. So that's generally been like a really interesting, compelling stat when we talk to our clients about, why they should give it a shot or why they should test the tactic as a medium. And then Quill as an agency would typically work with large enterprise brands, and brands like Marriott or PwC or L'Oreal, and we have seen firsthand how podcasting can really foster engagement, build really intimate relationships with your consumers and stakeholders, and even change consumer perception. I think we live in a time where consumers are really craving authenticity and they want to know the story behind the brand and really connect with your mission. And I just think podcasting is a really great way of humanizing your brand and showing your audience what's behind like the big corporate logo.
At AG1, our goal is building relationships with really great creators and investing in them for the long term. They grow as we grow, and in turn, they have steadfastly supported us. We're so proud to be among many podcasts' first supporters, and have loved growing with them and their audiences. A great example is Tim Ferriss. Our relationship with him began many years ago when he was an AG1 drinker, and he went on to mention us in his best-selling book, The 4-Hour Body. Now we've been partnering with his podcast, The Tim Ferriss Show, for many, many years. And as far as one of the most unexpected benefits that we didn't foresee when we initially kind of put down our roots in the podcasting space was how our very strong relationships with our creators became a self-feeding ecosystem for us to build our new talent pipeline. So with these creators that we have really wonderful relationships with, they would recommend or refer us to their podcasting peers, and it became a great way for us to find new AG1 advocates and really build that talent pipeline.
Coming from a brand perspective, I would say that every brand is really fighting for attention. And from my point of view, there's no better way to capture someone's attention than through a podcast, and to really own that message, to really showcase who you are, to your point, what really matters to you, and to be able to tailor that message to a very specific audience. And so we have seen some success with this podcast about the journey, which was really about the power of travel and how to connect with people in a destination and to make the most of your travels through these personal connections. And so through the storytelling, we were able to do just that, and seen some really positive results from changing brand perception or elevating brand perception just by being in someone's ear in that very intimate way. So that's what I would say.
No, it's a great answers all around. And I think, Robin, I had some questions for you, because when it comes to branded podcasts, when we think about a consumer's media attention, it's a very fragmented landscape. Not even just podcasts, but also, you mentioned Netflix, and there's a million things that people could be consuming in terms of media. What are the storytelling techniques, or what are some ways that you can think of to help a brand cut through the noise, because you're vying for people's media attention?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would say, and this is going to seem very simple, is to tell a good story. I think that, and this cuts across any medium, right? You want to be able to connect with someone through the story that you're telling. You want someone to stop what they're doing. You want someone to capture their attention in that moment. And that is what we've been seeking to do with our storytelling, is to make sure that we were optimizing for that best story, for capturing someone in the early moments of a podcast, to make sure that we were pulling through the most captivating moment from the podcast, so that people are like, oh, I wanted to answer this question, or this is something I didn't know before, to be able to capture them right in those moments and keep them listening throughout. And we found that very successful. I know we're talking about audio here, but in this last season of the podcast, we really leaned heavily into video and being on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So this was another kind of storytelling tactic for us, is how do we make this as visually compelling as it is, from an audio perspective, and how do we match those two things together, right? People might be thinking, oh, I'm so focused on the visual that I'm missing the audio, but we were constantly thinking about that in developing this season of the podcast. So that's it. My short answer is tell a good story.
It's good advice. Have something to say,
Exactly.
Really.
Right. And, be thinking about who you're speaking to, who are you trying to reach? How do you want to impact that audience, and help move them to act or think differently, or connect with your brand.
Yeah, and I think there's to connect with your brand, and ultimately we have marketing objectives, mm-hmm. right? And they are congruous with what you're trying to do, but how do you balance achieving brand marketing objectives without sacrificing like the best podcasts are the ones that tell a story, that have a strong point of view. And at the end of the day, branded podcasts for for-profit companies are still trying to make the company money in some way. Even if it's moving hearts and minds, you're still ultimately, there's a myth that brand advertisers don't look at metrics.
Yeah.
And it makes me laugh every time. But how do you produce it in a way that puts the brand at the forefront, but also it feels organic, it feels natural, it feels normal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Marriott is in the travel business, right? So naturally telling that story makes sense for us to do. And then also we're trying to figure out how do we infuse the brand in a way that doesn't feel icky, right? You just want people to understand a little bit about who you are and how travel makes sense in the context of how you travel. And so yes, you will be staying at a hotel. Do we have, people kind of sitting at the bar and doing all those hotel-y things throughout? No, not necessarily. It is more, this is a jumping off point for your adventure, and this is what travel is meant to be. I see someone in the audience that helped us so much, Paul, with Signal Hill, in terms of taking a look at, the impact of this podcast. And what we saw is that people, really did have a better impression of Marriott after listening, after viewing, that they really were moved to think about their next stay, with Marriott based on this. And also that they felt like this brand was connected to them, that they saw themselves in the storytelling, and that made them, connect more with the brand. And I think that, to me, is, that is still heads in beds. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be today, but, later down the line, someone is going to say, I listened to this amazing thing, I heard about this amazing property through this storytelling, and I want to stay here. And that's the point.
Yeah, and it's really hard to buy those kinds of brand interactions, but I am very fond of saying that podcast advertising is actually still one of the places where, I think there's going to be a moment for many companies. It is not a question of either or. If you were coming to this show, to this panel, and expecting us to say, don't invest in a branded podcast, or don't invest in paid advertising, the answer is a mix of either or both is going to be appropriate for different brands, right? And when you think about the authenticity, when I think about AG1, you guys have built very strong relationships with podcast creators. And what have you learned about audience trust and host-read ads specifically that other brands may overlooked or have overlooked in the channel?
So since 2010, our steady growth has really been driven by word of mouth, millions of customers around the world who we have helped transform their journey with health ownership. And it's our job with our creators to bring those stories to the forefront. And that really represents our next chapter in our marketing and content strategy. We only work with people who drink AG1. That is a full stop prerequisite to any type of formal partnership. And what many people don't know is that we have worked with many people who drink AG1. They started consuming the product, loving it, recommending it to people in their life long before we had any type of formal agreement. Andrew Huberman, for instance, has been drinking AG1 for a little over a decade, and we started partnering with his podcast in 2021. So we really focus on leading with that personal story, that personal recommendation, rather than a brand message.
Yeah.
And from there, our creators have the freedom to speak about their product in their own words that feels endemic to their audio content, and is really true to their own voice, which helps build our trust with them and for them to maintain their trust with their audiences.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the other part of it, though, I will say this, is that some brands might be reluctant to have, like, even podcast hosts, influencers, whatever, to trial, to distribute product. And I do not think that is a challenge with you guys. Like, you want everybody to try the product. You want them You'll send product, you want them to try it, you want them to be really enthusiastic. Are there other factors that when brands are selecting podcasts that you think are, of paramount importance? Like, what are some of the factors that go into it besides, it might sound silly, but besides being able to personally endorse the brand in a host-read endorsement environment, what are some of the other factors that you think are important when you're looking at which podcast to sponsor?
Definitely that overwhelming energy and enthusiasm for the product or service is key. Krystina, I'm going to reiterate something that you said earlier, which is strongly considering the podcast verticals that you're investing in and understanding where the alignment is with your brand and mission, and also understanding that there are many, many people that consume content that is not necessarily right in your brand's vertical that are still a prime audience for your product. So health and wellness, personal improvement, growth mindset podcasts are definitely core for us, but there are plenty of people that care about personal improvement and health and wellness that listen to news and sports and comedy. So understanding where the alignment is and also where you can find these audiences in things that don't overlap is, I think, something that's typically missed by brands that are new to the space.
Yeah, and sometimes the verticals are really surprising for what works, and sometimes the shows are really surprising for what works. I won't put you on the spot, but if there is one that you think of where you're like, that was shocking that this worked so well. Or
like people who build their homes to model like Victorian interior spaces, bird watching, like truly the most niche, because that's where the people who are listening to bird watching podcasts, they're really there for a reason. They are really excited about bird watching.
Yeah.
So when that host says that they are crazy about AG1 and it's a non-negotiable in their day, that audience is all ears.
I love that so much. That is, I'm gonna actually steal bird watching as my new, if somebody is really passionate about something, but that passion translates to the brand. And it's very also clear in the way that, but bird watching enthusiasts also can drink AG1. We contain multitudes. So Fatima, through Quill, you've worked with so many different brands on their audio strategies. What do you find are the long-term advantages in investing, on the flip side, in a branded podcast?
So with our clients, we've found that it's just a really great way to build corporate culture. I mean, a lot of our clients are using podcasts to communicate with their employees, replace town halls, replace onboarding, HR onboarding practices. So that's always an avenue that nobody really externally considers, that brands are now using internal podcasting as a way to connect with their stakeholders and employees. It really bridges the gap between the executive leadership team as well, and makes them a little bit more accessible. The second, I would say, most obvious advantage that our clients find for themselves is being able to use podcasting as a way to not only connect with existing stakeholders, but bring in new audiences that haven't necessarily either heard of the brand or interacted or engaged with the brand. So I will say there are some intangible benefits from a lead generation and sales perspective. And I think really gone are the days where, it's just brand awareness. Like, we do see the impact on bottom line.
Yeah.
And then I would say finally, I think audio format shows and video format shows are a really great way to position your team as thought leaders and subject matter experts within your industry, within your vertical. We work with a lot of pharmaceutical brands, and I think that there's oftentimes a little bit of a stigma or negative connotation to pharma companies. And so with one of the brands that we're working with, we produced a show about the opioid crisis, and it's all about supporting people who are going through opioid addiction or loved ones that are impacted by the opioid crisis. And I think that the clients that we're working with have seen very tangible benefits for some of that heat and negative perception that their brand has faced through some of the educational content that they're putting out. Another example, and this is more of a personal one, is that we are huge ice cream consumers. In fact, especially these days, I actually have an ice cream subscription because goodness, I can get through a pint a day.
But I think legally, like that is an allowable requirement. I think you can eat as much ice cream as you damn well please.
I think so. It's, you know, this is the reason I've been turtling around these days. I usually have a pint of Ben & Jerry's wherever I go.
Which Ben & Jerry's is your favorite?
I don't know. I think Funky Monkey and Cherry Garcia are like my two favorites, depending on if I want fruity or chocolate. But
I love that.
They're all amazing. I'm like a huge advocate for their product, because a few years ago I heard their podcast episode on how I built this with Guy Raz, and that was when I was first introduced to the brand. Before that, I would literally just buy whatever was on sale.
Totally.
Huge Haagen-Dazs consumer. And then I heard the episode on how I built this. I got to learn a little bit more about all the social activism work that they're doing and the mission behind the brand. It wasn't just Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company. It was the Ben & Jerry's, the brand story. And now we only buy Ben & Jerry's products. We are so loyal to the brand. And of course, through their podcast episodes, started following all of the other forms of content that they put out. And that is how I built brand loyalty with that particular product. So I do think it works. And I think our clients are finding more and more. That's why we typically see them investing in additional seasons, because I think it's a medium that has often been overlooked.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And it is the kind of thing where like Ben & Jerry's and learning about the company and even just understanding and learning more about the company, and sometimes understanding and learning more about the employees of a company and the mission behind it, and just humanizing companies.
Totally.
It can be a really hard thing to do in the space of a paid social ad.
Yeah.
And so, but on the flip side of it, there are definitely some blind spots that brands might not realize they have in their rearview mirror when they're thinking about, you know, do I create a podcast or do I sponsor existing ones? And for you, what are some of the blind spots that they might have when they're debating if it is an either or scenario, which I have other thoughts on that.
There's such different tactics. It's a question I get asked all the time, especially during the sales process. And it is surprising that it's either or, because I feel like the benefits and the ROI are so different for both strategies.
So much
that it's like literally comparing apples to oranges. One is citrusy, one is like crunchy. I just like don't know how to compare the two. But I will say with our clients, generally speaking, one is a much bigger lift. So creating your own branded podcast is a much bigger lift than sponsoring ads. And so that sometimes becomes like the biggest consideration. The other thing to note is a 30-second or 60-second ad slot, great for promoting your products and services. It's like a quick bite of, you know, what your company's about, and it can be a little bit salesy. When you're producing a branded podcast, it can't be salesy. It's all about the content and providing value. And so our clients who decide to opt for a podcast, it's because they want to tell their brand story and provide valuable content to their consumers and position themselves over the long run as a thought leader and subject matter expert. You can't necessarily build a long-term relationship through a 30-second ad slot. It has a different benefit, tangible benefit, I would say, the 30-second ad slot. I would also say that another huge benefit of launching a podcast that our clients gravitate towards is getting a content ecosystem. So it's not really just a podcast that they're getting. We are converting their transcripts into a blog. We are capturing audio and video content and cutting it down for promotional clips and YouTube shorts. We're converting it into a newsletter, capturing emails through an email magnet. So it's not a podcast that just lives in isolation on YouTube or Apple or Spotify, but a 360 content strategy that's being repurposed for their existing channels. I think sponsoring ads is equally important, but more sales generated. And there's, you know, potentially if you're limited in bandwidth, then I'd say a really great strategy for building brand awareness and getting, I would say, your brand out there in a way that's likely a much lower lift than actually investing in a whole season.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and it's, you know, I'm going to open this up a little bit because I think there is an either or perception, and my thing is, and I'm curious to get your thoughts actually, just as you were talking, I kind of thought about this. There are definitely some moments in like heavily commoditized categories, or moments where you're like, are there ever times where you tell a brand like, I like love you, mean it, but like we can't make a branded podcast that's going to be interesting because you sell widgets and nobody cares. But can you make fetch happen? Like, is it genuinely, like, are there times where you're just like, I want you to do this in a way that's successful for you. I find that, in my line of work, especially in sponsorship, there are brands that come to us and they're like, I really want to do podcast advertising. I'm like, I love that, but you're not ready, or you want to do it for a reason, like you want to tell your brand story. That host is not going to tell your brand story the way that you want them to.
Totally.
But are there times where you're yeah.
We turn away customers all the time. There's so many red flags to like not wanting to start, like not wanting to do a podcast for them. The first is if your audience is boomers, like, or like, what's the category below Gen Z?
Gen Alpha?
Gen Alpha. I don't know if a lot of Gen Alphas are listening to podcasts, but like definitely I know my 80-year-old dad is not listening to podcasts. So like
same.
Yeah, well there you go.
Doesn't understand what I did. My parents are in their 80s as well. Literally is like she does something with the Google, 100% that's what he says. Like
exactly. They can't explain what a podcast is. So that's not your audience. You're not going to reach the boomer audience if you're creating content. So that's the first thing we look at. Who are you trying to reach with your content? And if it's not older millennial professionals or just millennials in general, I would say probably not the right category for you. The second thing we look at is like, what are the KPIs that they care about? So many people are just concerned about the listener and download count, and I always tell people you can buy traffic all day long, but you can't buy audiences. So if you are looking for us to pump a bunch of money into ad spend to buy traffic, we're not building a community around your podcast. And so it's really a waste of money if people aren't going to be listening to your show. The widget comment was interesting because I do think you can have an incredibly boring and dry company, but still create a really compelling podcast, because the point of the podcast is not to promote your company and to talk about products and services. It's to create an educational or inspiring or narrative show that inspires people, and it can be completely unrelated to the widgets that you're selling. Now, if you want to organically weave in the widgets somehow, great, power to you. But we had a bank reach out to us recently, and they wanted us to create a cybersecurity podcast promoting the company's cybersecurity products. And I was like, okay, literally no one is going to listen to this show. We cannot do this for you. But they gave us creative reins, and we created a cyber hacking podcast. So very similar to Reply All, interviewing in a narrative style folks who have been impacted by cyber crimes. Now that's something I want to listen to. I want to listen to the person whose identity has been stolen and their life has fallen apart because of their identity being stolen. I don't want to listen to the products and services provided by this bank. So I do think the job of a producer is to convert it into content that people will want to listen to. So it really depends on how open the brand is.
I love that so much. It goes back to just please tell a story.
Yeah.
Please give us something. Like I'm, and Robin did not pay me to say this. I have been a Marriott customer for 20 some odd years. I love Bonvoy. I was an SPG girly before that.
Like, the points are the best.
The points are the best out there. Again, we're not paid actors. But also travel is such like a deeply personal thing. So do you find that, I'm sure there is some pressure internally sometimes for it to be like, it's got to be more of this or it's got to be more of that. Do you find like sticking to an artistic point of view, like meaning like having integrity in the way that you're telling the story? Have you seen the results from that?
Yes. I mean, I think, just to go back to your previous question about either or, Marriott has done both, right? We created our own podcast internally for the purposes that I've shared, which is really to engage with that audience and really tell a story about who we are and what we care about and how impactful we believe travel is. But then also they do campaigns, they do marketing campaigns that they have put ads in podcasts. And I'll go back to even your previous panel where you were talking about a media agency trying to understand the podcast space and the success of a paid ad in podcasting, And I think I agree. I feel like the media agencies do not fully understand the medium and how to make it successful. And I think, the company had seen that as an impact, and they think, oh, maybe podcasting doesn't work because they see that it's not performing in the way that they're used to things performing, et cetera. And so, but we also have this podcast that we've created where we are seeing a change in sentiment, where we're seeing a change in perception, where we can point to the fact that people have changed their minds or think differently about the brand. And we can talk about engagement. We can talk about how long someone listens to a podcast, how long someone is watching this video on YouTube. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of hours of listen and watch time. Who doesn't want that, right?
Absolutely. And to your point, one of the saddest things to me is I talk to dozens of brands a month. And one of the most common things I hear when people come in and they're like, I have a negative perception of podcasting. It didn't work for me. I'm like, all right, what'd you do? How'd you run it? Oh, your media agency that's from one of the big holding companies, and I get to say that because I used to work at one. Your media agency tried to do it via a trading platform. They tried to basically buy it in a commoditized fashion, and it's like, podcasting doesn't work. And it's like, well, you've never tried to do that, like a branded podcast. You've never taken the very partnership-oriented approach that Margaux and her team at AG1 have done. And it is an interesting question. Do you find that there's a tipping point to where you're like investing in a branded podcast or, essentially, I'd imagine borrowing influence from influential people?
I think your question about either or is really interesting because I really think about it is what is the right move at this moment in time?
For what you're trying to do.
Yes, and determining the goal of this media or content budget is really essential before taking another step forward. And I think with a branded podcast, if you're in the phase of growth in your business where building trust and credibility, storytelling, having owned content, Fatima, the way that you kind of outlined that, and then all the way that becomes serving of your other media channels was so valuable, then the long form nature of a branded podcast is really well suited for those goals. If you're in a phase of growth in your company where building a growth engine and new customer acquisition and volume is really critical for where you are, then working with creators who have a lot of times a larger, more established audience with really routine listenership is a great move. And borrowing influence is a great way to put it, and really collaborating with that creator on the best way for them to share their story about your product or service to accomplish those lower funnel acquisition goals, then the latter can be a great fit there.
Yeah, it's so important it's what are you trying to accomplish? And just asking yourself that at the outset of any kind of campaign, regardless of whatever execution you're going to ultimately execute. Super great English going on over here. Being intentional about it. And I also think, like, even just on our side of the business, the times that I've said no have ultimately wound up being some of the most impactful times, because it's really hard. It's a very crowded space. There are so many podcasts, and there are so many podcasts that nobody besides the host's mom or dad listens to. And so when it comes to marketing strategies to drive audience growth, to drive engagement, either through sponsorships or own content, I'll let anybody to kind of weigh in here, but what have you seen like that's innovative or bold, or that you're like, man, that just worked so well for either the brands that you work with or brands that, are out there in the medium?
Well, I think Athletic Greens is obviously doing like an amazing job in terms of like how they're leveraging marketing, their own internal marketing to promote their shows. I will say, when it comes to podcast audience growth and marketing, I think what people need to realize is podcast listening is very transactional. We're essentially asking for listeners' most valuable resource, which is time. And in exchange, they're asking to be educated or inspired or entertained in some format. And so understanding their key drivers of appeal and then really trying to level up editorially, I think is so important. There's 4 million podcasts out there today, and then 18% of them are active, which shows us there's so many podcasters that launch really enthusiastically with a really great idea, and then soon after either don't realize how much work it is to actually make a show successful, or don't want to put in the time and effort to grow their audiences because it's a grind.
Yes.
It's a grind. And so
it really is.
I think that there's a couple of things that you can look at from what's different from just the rinse and repeat. And the first is approaching podcasting in a very data-driven way and figuring out who your audience is, and then trying to level up the content to tailor it to be something for someone. Like the bird watchers that you've talked about. I think great, that's such a niche audience. How many bird watching podcasts are out there? Probably not that many. Our product co-host actually identifies things like psychographic and demographic information on listeners, so their age, their household income, their interests, their hobbies. And that's really important to our clients because they take all of that data and then they try to actually tailor the content for their audiences that are tuning in. On the marketing side, we can see things like on our product, like what social platforms they're on, where they're actually consuming their content. So when it comes time to marketing, rather than just trying everything under the sun, we tailor it to where they're actually consuming their content to scale audiences that way. And so I think approaching podcasting in a data-driven way is a new way of marketing that I think a lot of podcasters haven't really considered. And like I mentioned earlier, not just focusing on the download count, but really thinking about how you can provide content of value, and just really, content is everything. And so remember the traffic comment that I made earlier, you can buy traffic, but you can't buy your audience. So those are really, I would say, the things that I don't see enough of in the industry, and the data side of things, I would say, has helped us immensely in terms of audience growth. So the generalized marketing tactics, I would say, don't always convert podcast listeners. And we have a lot of clients that will sign on with us for production and then say, our agency of records have got the marketing, we don't need you. And then very quickly after, they come back and they're like, well, they weren't able to get us the downloads. And I'm like, well, it's because they're running Google ads and social ads and PR, which is great for brand awareness and engagement, but you're not focusing on the podcast industry tactics that actually work. So really know what drives listeners. And if I'm looking for a podcast, I'm not necessarily going on Google or LinkedIn to find my next show.
Yeah,
I would just tag on and kind of go back to something that you said about podcasts not living in a bubble, right? That you are creating packages, you're showcasing this podcast in multiple ways, and I think that has to be a part of your strategy to grow. And then I will talk about YouTube once again, because I feel like this is a question of discoverability, and we know now that YouTube is the thing, right? That everyone is discovering their podcasts through YouTube. So, if you're not there in some way that makes sense for you to be there, it's something I think that one has to consider at this point.
Yeah, and it's very prescient that you mentioned that about, advertising doesn't always translate to downloads. You can make people aware that you have a podcast. It's like whatever, the lead a horse to water thing.
Yeah.
It is really hard to get people to drink. And having experienced that firsthand now, I can tell you from a download perspective, I made this joke earlier, but it was actually very sobering because we buy some of the most scaled podcasts in the world. When I started looking at the downloads for our own show, I was like, but where are they? Why isn't anybody listening to our show? Why doesn't anybody like us? And then it was like, oh, right, we're a B2B podcast focused on growth marketing, and we tell really niche stories. And I went, oh, these are pretty good numbers, actually. So part of it is not being disappointed in yourself, realizing that there are only so many bird watchers. And then also, the transitive moment for me was, I was on a call, like we don't really have a sales team, but we get on consultative calls with prospective customers all the time. And somebody was like, oh yeah, I listened to that episode with so-and-so and the CMO from DSW. And I was like, cool. I can only actually produce this podcast if I don't think anybody listens to it, is another trick that I've learned about myself. I'm like, if I pretend that nobody's listening to me, it works better. But it's like that in that moment, for B2B especially, it's like, dude, I couldn't buy that kind of interaction. I can't get somebody to listen to me talk about what I do and what we do for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God.
Well, we're also just like so spoiled from an ad platform perspective. Like you probably looked at your numbers and saw, I'm just making up this number, but like maybe you saw 200 downloads and you're like, that's only 200 people listening to my show. Like that's so upsetting. Think about 200 people in this room. That's a lot of people. What if it's 200 decision makers, C-suite professionals who are listening to your show? Like that's hugely impactful. But I think the problem has become there's so many players in our industry that are promising false numbers where it's like, put $2,000 into this platform and overnight we're going to get you 15,000 downloads. Well, who are these 15,000 downloads that are like, where are they coming? Who are they? Are they an actual user agent and IP address? Are they actually listening to your show? Are they 16-year-olds that just signed up for the app and then automatically got subscribed?
Yes.
What's the consumption rate in listening? And by the way, I can speak like this because I have a production agency where we run ads, and then we have a hosting product where we can see whether those downloads are legitimate or not. So we are connecting the dots behind the scenes and being like, these are not legit listeners. And so I think if you looked at your numbers and you saw 200 downloads, 200 people listening to your show, and if they're listening all the way through to the end, that is great consumer interaction.
Yeah. I would also say this is a long tail game. This is a long game. You know, I think this is not a medium in which you put something out and you get an immediate, you know, rush.
That
it's
is
not
such a
that.
good point.
And so, you know, that's something else I think that people need to be aware of, is that you're in this for the long haul. You know, you're telling a story over time, and your audience is going to grow over time. This is what we saw. We were in the 4th season of this podcast and really started to see, you know, the impact of what we built. And so you have to have the stomach for that, or not, you know. And so I think that is something to really keep in mind.
That's so, it's funny you say that, because at first I was like nobody's listening. Also gave me a lot of empathy for the publishers that we work with, gotta be really honest, and for hosting platforms and for people who produce content, because it's really hard. And then eventually we started realizing like, oh, the numbers are going up, but then people went back and found other episodes that we did.
Yes.
And that's why like creating evergreen content, like I'm sure that, you know, you're in season 4, but I'm pretty sure you produced some really good content in seasons 1, 2, and 3.
Absolutely. It's always going to work for you. And again, to the point of this content bubble, you can always go back. You can make clips from something. You know, you're going to showcase it in many different ways across, you know, multiple mediums. So, you know, if you're thinking about it this way, you're building a content program. That's what you're doing. It's not just a podcast. It is a full ecosystem that you're building.
Yeah, people sleep on the organic search implications of this too. Like, we do a lot of YouTube endorsement and a lot of podcasts, simulcast, obviously. And people sleep on the fact that like there are YouTube videos with hundreds of thousands or millions of views that your ads are featured in. Like, hey, Google likes that. If only Google owned the platform that we were talking about. Like, it's a very kind of circuitous thing that we're talking about here, right? So it's just, there are so many intangible benefits to it. Same thing for like YouTube shorts, LinkedIn shorts. I don't have the time to sit there and produce video content, but I'll crank through and like we'll produce a few episodes of a show, and then it becomes this thing that you can then chop up in a way that's meaningful. And I don't know about you guys, I've discovered a lot of podcasts that I'm interested in via TikTok. I've never actually watched or listened to an episode of Call Her Daddy or New Heights, but I have absolutely consumed a lot of content on TikTok because that's my brain rot of choice.
So you've watched all the highlights for Call Her Daddy, you just haven't watched a full video episode.
Exactly.
This is the crux of everything we say about video shorts.
Yeah, it's really hard because it's like, Yeah, it's a very hard jump, but to your point, I am actually one of those people that you're like, well, you're not a listener. And it's like, ooh, that's interesting though. It's like you're a fan of the show, but you're not actually a listener to it. And then it starts to become, well, are you engaging with our content on other platforms? And is that meaningful? YouTube Shorts is a really hard nut to crack.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard. But if you're getting quality engagement on there, like, is that worth the same to you as somebody who's listening to an hour-long podcast? No. But is it still valuable? Yeah. So.
And everyone consumes content in different ways. Like some people actually prefer audio, some people prefer reading for accessibility purposes, some people prefer watching. Like it's to me, it's not the either or that you mentioned earlier, but it's like you're covering all of your bases to tailor your content to however people prefer to consume their content.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for worse, I won't even say for better or worse, but for worse, we have the attention span of goldfish. And so, like, if you have the ability to produce content that's so compelling that it transcends mediums, well, then you might actually bring somebody back to it. And even, like, I'm sure that there are some shows that you guys have worked with over the past where you're like, wow, those shows started out really small and then something happened. There was some sort of cultural event, or like they became huge on TikTok, or their profile rose, and then you were an early sponsor, and so your profile rose along with that.
Totally. Not to go back to the bird watchers for the upteenth time, but
no, please do. I think everybody's leaving this today and being like, you know, now all of a sudden, like, oh my God, look at that finch. I don't know any birds.
I kind of liken it when you sort of blow it up and think about culture, like bird watching could be what chess was with Queen's Gambit.
Ooh.
Like, you never know when something like that is going to become the center of the zeitgeist, that then it's going to, what once was niche is now mass. And back to the long tail nature of it as well, is we have ads that are baked into evergreen content from a year, 2 years, 3 years ago that are still producing a return for us today. So that's magic in podcasting you don't get certainly from Meta or Google.
But that's why I'm also willing to spend CPMs that I would never spend on Meta or Google. And that is part of the thing that makes me sad about seeing publishers strip out ads that we we bought them as evergreen. I will not, if we had a soapbox, I would get on it. But part of that is like, yeah, dude, I'm paying you a $35 CPM in that particular instance or whatever it is. It's like, do you think that anything in display, like you're talking a fraction of the CPM you'd be willing to pay for even that same content in a display setting, or, you know, on paid social. So it's such a interesting thing to think about, like, we are borrowing influence or we're creating influence, but ultimately it's all an attention economy. And I think the work that everybody's doing is really exciting to try and capture some of that attention in a bunch of different ways. I did want to thank you guys, first of all, so much for sharing so openly and for giving people actionable takeaways. You were fantastic.